So let me now introduce our first two speakers, two really amazing global leaders who bring unmatched experience to this conversation. I really can't think of two better people to launch this program. Michelle Bachelet served twice as president of Chile, as Chile's Minister of Defense and Minister of Health, as head of UN Women, and she now serves as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, the leading advocate for human rights within the UN system. But perhaps no experience has made her more qualified to speak about the importance of human rights than the experience she had as a young woman when she was arrested by the secret police of Augusto Pinochet and then imprisoned and tortured for her political views and allegiances. She has led a truly remarkable life. Brad Smith serves as president and chief legal officer for Microsoft, and he has played a gigantic role in global digital policy conversations. Arguably, he has done more than any other private sector technology executive to reinforce commitment to international human rights principles in the digital realm. He has also demonstrated tremendous thought leadership when it comes to articulating the responsibilities of private sector tech companies to society on a wide variety of fronts, ranging from defending democracy to protecting privacy to helping set normative constraints on cyber attacks against civilians. But perhaps most important for today's conversation, Brad has pushed Microsoft to role model what it looks like in practice for a technology company to embrace human rights commitments, to assess the human rights impacts of its own AI-related products and services, and to take responsibility for remedying those impacts. So let me welcome, and please give a warm welcome, to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and Brad Smith. So let me start off by saying what an honor it is to have both of you with us for this program today, but how especially valuable it is to have the two of you together. We simply want to try to role model here the value of cross-sector dialogue between you if we're going to be addressing governance challenges related to AI. And we'll touch on subjects related to the risks and benefits of AI technology, the relevance of the human rights framework, and the responsibilities of the private sector. And I will alert the audience in advance, somewhat, in a half hour or so, we will turn to all of you so that you can ask your questions of these two amazing speakers. So let me turn first to the High Commissioner. So your mandate covers literally the entire globe and all thematic human rights issues. But in your first 7 months as High Commissioner, you have directed special attention to the impact of digital technology on human rights. And I went back to a speech you gave recently in Geneva in November, where you said, one of the great tasks of the human rights community in the next few years will be to articulate how to apply the existing human rights framework in our digital environment. And for me, the most striking part of this speech was the compelling plea you made to young technologists, asking them to help bridge the communication gap between the human rights community and the tech community. So in this audience, we have a number of young technologists from Stanford and the broader Silicon Valley community. I wanted to ask you just to convey to these young technologists why a commitment to human rights matters. Why does it matter if the technology community embraces human rights? And what role can they play in helping reinforce the universal human rights framework?
Well, thanks, Eileen. Of course, as an office, we'll continue working on the more traditional, if I would say, human rights in terms of political, civil rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and also what we have been identifying like new challenges that the world faces today. There are common challenges like environment, climate change, and environmental rights on one hand, and of course, what brings us today here, how we relate and find out the relationship between human rights and technology. And in this on AI and of course cyberspace and digital area. So I know that our lives, our experiences today are full and with technology. Technology reaches a lot of people. Of course, you said so correctly, there's almost half of humanity who don't have access to some technology. And that is something that also concerns me, because it means that we might even make wider the gap between the ones that have and the ones that have not, between countries and within countries. And that's a problem, because I believe that human rights, it's about leaving no one behind. So this will be also a challenge. But going into more particularly the relationship that we see for technology and human rights. I mean, we all are very aware of that anything new can change and impact human rights in positive way or in negative ways. And I would say we all know the very important possibilities of technology in many different areas, expanding democracy, the thing you are doing, how to ensure to expand human rights, how we expand knowledge, how we expand access to different areas, the role that it can play in medicine, in astrophysics, in so many different areas. We are so clear about the importance of technology. But on the other hand, we also identify threats. And it's not potential threat, they're real threats that we have seen in many parts of the world. First of all, there is this, I would say, needed discussion on in which way technology and science could impact certain possibilities. For example, we have to think also, do the educational system, even in the US, are preparing children for jobs of tomorrow? What if through DNA procedures they can identify that I could have that or that disease? Would that mean any influence on the health insurance, how it will work, how it will treat people? So there's a lot of things that can be really impacted and have a complicated repercussion on people's life. But on the other hand, the current technology that we have right now, and also it's affecting people's life. We have seen people who have been tracked as human rights defenders, have been targeted and killed. We have seen hate speech through social media, and it's very well reported on the Myanmar case against the Rohingyas that triggered violence. And we have seen so many different cases where social media and technology has been used against people. But there's also potential use in terms of affecting people's lives. So what I would say to young technologists, I would say, please sort of embody human rights approach when you're dealing with technology, when you are developing different products, when you're thinking, always think, how can is this gonna improve people's life? It's gonna harm. And how I can include those in my developing system. Second, try to think on more cross-sectorial discussion. I mean, this is not about the tech community discussing about the implications of technology on human rights. It's also discussed with scientists, with social workers, with other areas that will identify which can be the impacts of human rights. I think this university is a great place to do that, to bring together and to discuss all the intersections on technology and human rights, because you have different fields that they can all work together on that. And of course at the workplace, I mean, people who work in different companies that can be very alert and on one hand, including human rights approach when they do their job, but also standing up when they feel that something is going in the wrong direction. So I think it's a very important role what the tech community can do, but it has to be not isolated. It has to be done with others to identify issues that maybe they don't identify, but others can bring to them their attention.
That's great. We're all in this together, definitely. All right, so let's turn to Brad Smith in the same vein, really. Arguably, more than any other technology company, this is me speaking, Microsoft has really embraced its commitment to human rights and led in the development of internal AI human rights impact assessment processes. And I bet most people here are not well aware of what's happening inside Microsoft in that regard. So starting question is simply, how have you imbued this sense of a human rights sensibility into the technology culture at Microsoft? And why did Microsoft choose to embrace universal human rights as a basis for understanding your responsibilities?
Well, great questions, Eileen. And first, just thank you to everybody. It's wonderful for me to be here. It's always an honor to share the stage with the High Commissioner. I really fundamentally believe that the High Commissioner for Human Rights serves as one of the world's most important voices for humanity. And humanity has perhaps never needed a voice quite like it does today. I will first say we don't have all the answers at Microsoft. I wish we did. I think we're all on this journey together. And every day we're learning more from other great companies and colleagues, not just across the tech sector itself, but I think especially with academia and in great academic institutions like Stanford. As I think about what we're trying to do, I do think that there's two interesting dimensions to think about. One is what I would call weaving together old and new, and the other is principles and practice. By the old and new, I really mean the great human rights principles that were established in the 20th century, together with new human rights challenges that we're facing in this current century. It's worth just pausing and reflecting for a moment on the vision that the generation of people demonstrated, in my view, in the 5 years after World War II. It wasn't perhaps truly universal, because I think one must acknowledge that there are many countries that exist today that were colonies at that point, so they didn't have a seat at the table in their own right. But nonetheless, the world came together. It came together here, or at least close to here, in 1945 to create the United Nations in San Francisco. But out of that, there then came the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the issues that we're thinking about today really have in many ways guiding principles in those documents. When we're talking about privacy as a human right, we can go back to the Universal Declaration. When we're talking about the freedom from bias and discrimination, we're talking about human rights that were really acceded to by the world. So I think that these principles speak to us today. But there's a new element as well. Just as it took a generation to come together then, I would argue we are the generation that needs to come together now to establish, in many ways, a new human right that wasn't needed then because it was taken for granted. The principle that the decisions made by machines will be accountable to people, that they will be accountable to and will serve humanity. No one contemplated a world in 1945 or 1949 where machines could go make decisions by themselves and impact human rights, whether it was privacy or discrimination and bias and the like. So we are the people that need to do what that generation of people did for the future then. We need to do it now. So I think it really beckons to the entire tech sector to take this head on. So how do we do it? Well, it really is a combination of principles and practice. It does start, I believe, with having real clarity around the principles themselves, and we've sought to define that. And Google, I think, has done a great job. Other companies have done some great work in this space. You can learn a lot just by comparing the different principles we've articulated, and whether they're given the label ethics or human rights, you see a lot more similarities than differences. But certainly what we've learned is that setting forth principles may represent the essential first start, but it's only the first step. And you need to turn these principles into policies. You need to implement them through a combination of code. There is a huge challenge and opportunity for the engineers of the industry. You need to implement them through policies that are implemented then by salespeople around the world, where you make decisions about whether you will provide your technology to a particular customer for a particular user scenario. You need to create business processes. You need to create compliance systems. And you need to do this on a global basis, even when you're serving hundreds of millions or billions of customers, something that no one, in fact, has ever had to do before. So the sheer logistical challenge in this is enormous. And that's why I really do feel that we're all on the relatively early stages of a journey together.
So just one follow-up there. To what extent do you see other companies turning to the human rights framework and being willing to engage in a similar process and doing human rights impact assessments? We have some people here in the audience whose work is developing these processes, and I'm curious, to what extent do you feel like you're standing alone in this space, and how many companies are starting to catch on?
I definitely don't think we're standing alone. I think there's more companies than you might think, and there are fewer than we need. I think both of those things are clear. I think that the whole concept of doing human rights impact assessments are fundamental to then really understanding how your technology is being created and how it's being deployed. I think some of the early work was really led by the human rights community, by the civil society organizations. A lot of it came together in the Global Network Initiative, GNI. So when you look at other companies that have been involved in GNI from the early days, including companies like Google and Facebook, people are working through these. These are not easy things, I hasten to add. I think that we are going to need more companies to do this, and even the nature of these impact assessments keep evolving. I will say, one of the most important human rights questions, in my view, in the tech sector today comes not only in the context of AI, but just where are we going to put data centers? And what data are we going to put in those data centers? Because once you put a citizen's or consumer's data in a data center in a country, you have to recognize that a government, the government of that country, is likely going to be able to access that data. And so we have a human rights impact assessment that has always been a defined part of our process for making these kinds of decisions. And there are days, in my view, when we must say no, either to the data center or to certain categories of data. And that is one thing that I think badly needs to move around the world urgently to every company, not just the tech sectors that people think about on the West Coast of the United States, but to the telecommunications companies that are opening up data centers, because that is precisely the kind of thing where we're going to wake up and we're going to have the High Commissioner pointing out quite rightly that we made a mistake, and that people have been prosecuted or persecuted or executed. And before we get to that day, we need to make these decisions ourselves to try to avoid those kinds of outcomes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I agree with him, but with Brad. But what I've seen more is that a lot of companies have gone through defining like an ethics code, but not necessarily with the whole human rights approach. And the problem with ethics is very important, the ethic part, and they have invested a lot in ethics, is that ethics can change from one company to the other, can change from one country to another. So that's why, and you did say it so correctly when you started, that's why it's so important to use the human rights framework and the human rights international laws, because they, as you said correctly, they are internationally agreed. They're a common language for everyone and can help you know what is right and what is wrong. Because if every individual decides what's the ethical way of doing it, I mean, we will have problems and we'll have mistakes. So that's why one of the things we want in this different in the visit is to discuss with a lot of companies to advance, not to get only into the ethical perspective, but also on the human rights platform and perspective. And Brad has been a great champion on this as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. So it connects with what Brad said earlier. It's that the AI has to be accountable for the impact on humans,
Yes.
which is what the human rights framework does. We need a global basis for thinking about this. That's also a valuable attribute of the human rights system. And I also, to your point, Brad, it's not, it's pre-AI. It's digitization itself and the collection of data that is a fundamental change in society with gargantuan implications for the enjoyment of human rights. And so we do have to think about those things even before we get into the effects of the machine processing. So I want to come to another subject you've both a little bit touched on, which is this dual nature of technology. You've both spoken about on the one hand, AI and digital tech can be used very effectively by civil society actors and human rights defenders, to exercise human rights, to expand access to information, even to detect or prevent human rights violations. But we all know the same technologies can be used for malign purposes. So I was going to ask the High Commissioner, from your vantage point, well, I want to start with the dark side, and maybe we'll get to the good side too. You've spoken out about some of the dark implications of digital technology, particularly related to ubiquitous surveillance and how these technologies can restrict the rights of vulnerable populations. So which technologies are you most concerned about, and what are your darkest fears about how AI could be utilized going forward?
Well, I have different concerns. I mean, one concern can be to be used as shrinking civic space, for example. As we were mentioning, identifying people who are very active and targeting those people. Unfortunately, we see it without technology. We see a shrinking of civic space today in the world. A lot of civil society organizations, NGOs, they don't get enough funding to be able to, do their jobs, and they are arrested or even killed. So with or without technology, but sometimes technology helps to get to them in a faster way. We also see problems with discrimination. And I have seen, and probably Brad knows a lot about this, on gender bias, for example, some platforms that are recruitment platforms and other platforms who are gender biased, but also racial bias. And that I think it leads to a lot of discrimination in terms of people are applying to jobs or other kinds of situations. And also, of course, the big data collection that you were talking about. I mean, why should somebody know everything about my life? Do I want them to use that information in which way? Even if it's not in the worst way, even though it doesn't meant to kill me, but why? What is the right of privacy of people and the right to know that some things are happening? And I have to tell you, I think young people outside the technological community don't really know a lot of what's going on. And I have to say, I mean, a lot of people believe that if they erase something from the cell phone, it's not there anymore. So people don't know that all this information is in the cloud and that a lot of data can be collected. So there's a lot of issues on that regard, I would say.
Yeah, privacy is a much more nuanced issue than most people have realized. It's coming to the fore now, but we've had a whole generation growing up without a full appreciation of privacy, and it may be coming back. So on that subject, I wanted to ask Brad specifically about facial recognition technology, which is obviously one of the most highly contested applications of AI. It can be beneficial or at least benign, such as in our current use of AI to unlock mobile phones and facial recognitions. But on the other hand, it doesn't take an out-of-control imagination to envision how facial recognition could be used for unchecked mass surveillance and really lead to a dystopian version of a digitized society. So you have called for government regulation of facial recognition. That in and of itself is a pretty unusual move for a technology company. What is it about facial recognition that makes it ripe for government regulation? How is it different from other AI-related technologies?
Well, first of all, I'm not fundamentally certain it will be different from all other AI-based technologies. I simply think it is one of the early examples of where the rubber is meeting the road. If you look at some of the two earliest controversies that are more specific for AI and human rights or ethics, one is around weapons and the other is around facial recognition. I do think facial recognition is really taking off as a topic that people are discussing for very good reason. I would first say it has many beneficial uses. I will be an advocate for its beneficial uses before I'll then talk about why I do believe it needs to be regulated. And obviously, unlocking a laptop or a phone is a matter of convenience. It's even actually a matter of security because you don't need to rely on a password as much. But there are many other uses that, in my view, are even more societally beneficial, whether it's helping someone who's visually impaired see the world, including recognizing who's walking into a conference room, or in certain instances, it's being used to diagnose certain diseases as a tool for physicians. And we're just getting started. But I do think right now there are three great threats. One relates to bias or discrimination. One relates to what we should think of as sort of commercial privacy issues. And the third really does relate, as you said, Eileen, to mass surveillance or fundamentally human rights or democratic freedoms. And the only way, in my view, to protect people from these risks is through the force of law and regulation. As many of you in this room know, anytime you're talking about an AI-based market, you face the risk that the market will tip early on to those who accumulate the most data, because they'll be able to use that data to further improve their product. And therefore, it is tailor-made, unfortunately, for the classic race to the bottom. People will just go out to do every deal they can so that they can get all the data they can and try to become the market leader. And I just don't see a way to prevent that kind of race to the bottom without creating this kind of legal or regulatory floor. So we have advocated legislation in each of these three areas. And some of these, I believe, we could actually combine law and regulation with market incentives. I have yet to meet a customer that wants to buy a facial recognition solution that is biased. But people don't have access to information today to compare products or services the way they do if they're buying groceries or a new car. And I think the public and customers deserve that. And when you think about the research that was really led by people here at Stanford and at MIT through the Gender Shades Project to really shine a light on gender disparities and also disparities for people of color, it really starts to point towards a regulatory path forward.
What's the status of that regulatory path? I mean, at least let's start with the United States. Where does it stand?
Well, we shared a proposal in December. I gave a speech at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and we're out very publicly evangelizing this across the country and around the world. In Washington State, we got as far as the state Senate. It passed a bill by a vote of 46-1 that would protect privacy and provide this kind of protection for facial recognition. I don't know that we're going to get it out of the entire Washington State legislature this year, but we're going to keep taking it to other state capitals. I think you're going to see congressional hearings in Washington, D.C. We've taken it to other countries around the world. I'm heartened by the interest that people are showing. It is becoming a very vibrant debate. To some degree, I think I worry a little bit that some people will make the perfect the enemy of the good, because we find that the most vocal debates are not between people who think that there should be control and the people who think there should be none. It's between the people who think this technology should be used but regulated and people who think it should be banned entirely. And I don't believe it should be banned entirely, because I think there are too many societal benefits that it will create. I don't think it will be banned entirely. I just don't think you're going to see legislative appetites to do that. What I would love to see is people embrace what I would call almost a new approach to technology regulation. Don't spend a decade debating the ideal world. Do for the world of technology regulation what we do every day in the world of technology itself. You create a first version of a product, you make sure it's good, you make sure it's useful, but you get it into use. And then you learn from it. That's how we move faster in the world of technology creation, and I believe it is a recipe that governments should start to consider for the world of technology regulation.
That is very much in keeping with our vision about global multi-stakeholder processes and engaging in a cross-sector dialogue and working with governments. We feel like governments can't do it alone. They need to be speaking to technology companies, but we also need civil society in the mix and stakeholders from every sector. So completely agree with that new approach to policy development. I feel like it's important that we touch on the gender issues. You both started to raise those. High Commissioner obviously previously served as head of UN Women. And you've both referenced already tremendous concern about gender bias as well as racial, ethnic bias being baked into data and reified. We're going to have a speaker right after this who will get at some of these subjects. We've also seen a tremendous problem with digital trolls against women, harassing and intimidating women in ways that are just peculiar and horrific. Even this past week, the young woman who was instrumental in helping generate first images of black holes, apparently as soon as she became public, the trolls were after her. At the same time, I observe, certainly within the Stanford community, that there is so much growing awareness about the risk of discrimination and bias in data, in code, the lack of diversity in the tech community, that it could be, maybe I'm just an optimist, that there is this opportunity for this big leap forward. And really making a push on gender inclusion in the tech community, in the coding community, to incorporate, certainly women and diverse people into the data. So I'm just curious about your sense of optimism versus, concern about the downside risks of gender inclusion. And I have to mention, one of the speakers on our program today is a young woman who came through this program that was started by Fei Li at Stanford. It's called AI for All. And I just feel like there's a tremendous amount of energy here around that prospect. So optimism, pessimism on this subject.
Well, first of all, we need to be clear on that there is a particular, I would say, impact on gender and on women. First of all, because as women usually worldwide have less access to technology, they are less into technology, and that's why we need to continue on SMT programs, empowering women, ensuring that more women are in the technology sector. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of the technological sector. Mm-hmm. It is the lack of diversity. Because it's not only about women, few women, few Latino, few Afro-American people. They need to include the whole representation of the population of a country, of the world, to really be able to ensure that we won't have different kinds of bias. That's one important thing. The second thing, of course, is the violence online. There are figures that are really impressive. Because you mentioned the trolls, I tweeted once because we had a lot of ministers, female ministers, don't feed the troll, because many people were feeding the trolls. And really, women are victims of targeted violence online in the European Union, in the European Parliament. That is 45 countries, 47% of female parliamentarians, we're not talking about common persons, receive threats of rape, aggression, and of even death. So we have a problem there, and it's needed to work on that. Yep. And on the other hand, what I already mentioned, discrimination. Mm-hmm. So we need to work on ensuring that, but I do believe that if we're talking about this today, there is an opportunity. And I just went to Japan to the WOW, that is the Women's Assembly in Japan, but also at the same time, there was the meeting of the W20. Those are women that are trying, that the G20 will include gender-responsive policies. And one of the issues that was discussed was exactly this, how we ensure that in the G20, that is in Japan, but in France it will be the G7, how technology and human rights and gender-responsive policies are included. So now these issues are being discussed, and there will be made decisions around that. So I think it's a huge challenge, but it's also a big opportunity.
Yeah, there's something about the technology that's creating this opportunity. Brad, how do you see it?
Well, the first thing I would say is there's tremendous cause for optimism, because whenever you start out at the bottom, the only way you can go is up. So, let's think about where we are today. Now, I will say that...
But excuse me, the politicians can pass exactly the opposite. They can have good rates of approval, you can only come down.
True. Now, first, we have one strength as an industry, in my view, when it comes to diversity, and many weaknesses. The strength is that we're multinationally diverse, because of this country's immigration policies and because of the increasing global distribution of basic research and development. And then on every other indicia, we're far less diverse than the world is, and hence less diverse than we need to be. I think we need to stay grounded in the fact that, especially because so many AI applications are very scenario-based, one must understand the different scenarios in which the technology is going to be deployed in real-world terms, and different people use it differently. So I just think it makes even more urgent the need to have better representation of women, certainly in the United States, of African Americans and Blacks, Hispanics and Latinos, of all of the diverse indicia that we should be thinking about. We just have a long ways to go. I think every day we should just remind ourselves we have a long ways to go. It's easy to talk about the long-term solutions, which are important, like the pipeline, but what really matters is what we're going to do today. And I think it just has frankly, if anybody wants to build a successful AI solution for anything, it just has created an imperative to have a more diverse team than one sometimes sees, especially on the technical sides of the technology companies. I think that the Gender Shades Project, again, really highlighted that nicely, but more than just capturing the fact that the technology was discriminating, in effect, with higher error rates against women because of the data sets that were being used, it just goes to show that a more diverse team is going to start by asking all the right questions. And I fundamentally think that a team that's asking the right questions is obviously going to be more successful in getting to the right answers. But then there is one other dimension that I would just highlight here as well, and it takes me back a little bit to the regulatory aspect. What we're finding is you can design an AI-based solution like facial recognition in a way where you really reduce the error rates for a particular group. Our facial recognition algorithms have been found by the National Institute of Standards and Technology to be at the very top in terms of performance. But then if a customer deploys that technology for a particular scenario, they may find a different experience because of some factors unique to that scenario. So this is a game changer for what it means for, just think about responsible technology or technology that respects human rights. It means that these issues need to be thought about not only by the companies that create the technology, but by every institution that uses it, whether it's a government, a university, an NGO, or a private sector customer. So one of the reasons this whole conversation is so important is that it ultimately needs to spread across society. And this whole discipline, whether we call it human rights or ethics or something else, needs to spread and become a center of expertise as well. And the last thing that I think it points to in terms of diversity is the multidisciplinary diversity that is becoming far more important to the future of technology. Mm-hmm. The history of the tech sector has been largely a history driven by engineers, by computer scientists, more recently by data scientists. But the people who got their PhD in ethics or philosophy or history or economics or humanities have much more of a role to play. And one of the, I think, litmus tests for the health of the technology sector a decade from now will be whether there are more jobs held by people who not only were trained in these other disciplines, but are continuing to apply their training in conjunction with, say, computer and data scientists to develop these solutions.
Yeah.
But may I add another positive possibility here in this country?
Yeah.
You have elected 100 congresswomen for the first time in the U.S. history, and I think that's also a great opportunity that gender perspective are included in all different decisions.
That's right. And back to the point, if you start low, you can move high. And I do, to your point though, Brad, I think all of us at GDPi, we sense a real opening with the technology community seeking our input on the human rights front, on the ethical front, on the normative front, and on this cross-sector policy conversation front. So there's a real shift happening, and I think it is because the concerns have risen to public consciousness and everybody's worried. So we're going to come to the audience in a minute. I want to touch on sort of the geopolitical question, or one of the geopolitical questions. I mean, at the end of the program, we're going to have a segment on national regulation, AI strategies, and the geopolitics of AI. This past year, though, there's been a lot of public debate about whether technology companies should sell AI products and services to governments, and if so, which governments, and for what purposes. And we've definitely seen tensions within companies between employees and leadership, exec leadership, particularly over whether those companies should sell AI technology to governments for military purposes and especially for potential weapons applications. So Brad, you have been fairly vocal on this and had to come out. What's your perspective on this debate, and how have your views been received within Microsoft by your employees?
Well, as an employee, I've agreed with everything I've said, so I got one vote. No, in all seriousness, I think it's a really productive conversation to have. And I think one always needs to ground oneself in the fact that even when you're disagreeing with people, they're actually raising the right questions. And it's how we find the right solutions. And certainly there have been increasingly a broad category of issues that people have focused on. AI and weapons or the military. There are issues around AI and facial recognition that go to specific government uses. Frankly, there have been debates about technology more broadly. People have said, gee, we shouldn't be selling technology to the immigration authorities or to oil companies. And whatever the list is today, my guess is it'll be longer, a year or 2 or 5 years from now in the future. And again, you really have to step back and start to work through each of them. It's not a single answer that we have found for everything. We certainly have felt that it's important to be principled. Now, when it came to AI in the military, we said that we would provide our best technology and all of our technology to the United States military. And we will do the same thing for other, say, NATO allies that have democratic processes and fundamental human rights controls. But we said something else as well. We said we would be actively and even proactively engaged in the public policy process to use our corporate voice to encourage the adoption through democratic processes of the kinds of laws and rules that we believe are necessary. And certainly, the number one issue, I think, right now when it comes to AI in the military, really does go to lethal autonomous weapons and whether they are going to be subject to appropriate and meaningful human control. And I think this is an important issue of domestic policy in the United States, and I think it is an important issue of global and international law as well. And when I follow what Human Rights Watch is doing, I think that even if I don't disagree with every nuance, I think they're on the right path in really digging into this issue of meaningful human control. When it gets to something like facial recognition, there have been deals that we've turned down. Just as there are countries to whom we won't sell our artificial intelligence for weapons. And what's been interesting is just to, again, highlight two very different scenarios. One was a proposed sale of facial recognition technology to the government of a country that Freedom House says is not free, that I think the High Commissioner would have concerns if we went forward, that wanted to deploy facial recognition across the capital city. And we looked at that and we said, we think that's going to put human rights at risk. We think it will undermine the ability of people to assemble and express their views, and so we said no. Now, another instance was here in the United States and here in California. We had a law enforcement agency in California want to deploy facial recognition in two very different scenarios. And again, this gets to the scenario-based issues that arise. One was to deploy it in a prison so that they would know where the prisoners were when they were outside their cell. We looked at that, we said it's a defined sample. We can be confident that there are low error rates. I think it was all men. There was no issue for women. But most importantly, it could promote safety in the prison. Because unfortunately, safety is a problem in many American prisons. That scenario we said we were comfortable with. The other scenario was they wanted to deploy it for the body cams and police cars of every car that was then out on patrol. And the reason they wanted to do it was anytime they pulled anyone over for any purpose whatsoever, they wanted to run a facial recognition scan through a database to identify whether it matched a list of suspects, and if so, they would take the person downtown for further questioning. And we said, this technology is not your answer. You're going to end up taking African Americans and other people of color and women downtown to be questioned when they did nothing wrong, because you're going to end up with this misidentification. And so we said, what was most interesting to me was we said two things to them. We said, number one, we won't sell you our technology for this purpose. But number two, we said, we don't think you should buy anyone's technology for this purpose. We actually think that our error rates are lower than what you're going to get from the competition. But it's just not the right way to put this technology to work. And the thing that I found most encouraging was from a customer perspective, they said, thank you for raising this. But it does go, in my view, to one of the cultural challenges that almost exists inherently in any company, in any industry. You exist to sell your product to anyone who wants to buy it. And so it points to this need to put in place these principles and controls and then have these debates. Believe me, the sales force was not excited, whether it was the sales force selling to the government for the capital city or the sales force that wanted to sell to the police force. And I got a very impassioned email from the head of the sales team in the first instance about how upset she was. It was a woman who led the team, that I had said no, that we wouldn't sell it to this government in this capital city. And that, as much as anything, to me, points to what companies need to work through. Put in place the controls, the processes, and then you have the days when you're unpopular, because that's the only way that you put these controls in place and make them stick.
Did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I want to say that, it's very important what Brett has mentioned, but you always need to discuss on how you relate the business model with the human rights framework, because sometimes we're thinking of a couple of situations, but there will be new situations. And the concept of allies not necessarily is the right one, because there are US allies who are bombing hospitals and school buses and killing children. Even though they're allies, that's not the only factor that needs to be considered. It's important, but you need to ensure how you respect human rights and that. And that's why it's so important, the discussion before you sell those products, the discussion before you even develop them. which are the limits, really. And the difficult thing is, who defines that? Who defines which are the limits? I think that's a very complicated issue.
Well, I also think that first of all, I agree with what you said. And it's why the development and licensing or sale of technology is but one part of the equation.
Yeah.
It goes to the fact, basically the first thing you said, I do a lot more than technology in my job. You do. I mean, and all these other pieces are of fundamental importance. The whole field of international humanitarian law, it speaks to, something I'm sure we would both agree with. It doesn't actually, whether you want to use a conventional weapon or a cyber weapon, don't attack a hospital.
Yes, of course.
And that's why we've been vocal in calling for new international legal instruments to protect how weapons are deployed, as well as what weapons are created.
Yeah.
So I would say you both do a whole lot more than technology in your jobs. And it's fascinating how you start with principles, but you're looking at very concrete applications and processes and how you think it through in a pragmatic vein. So, all right, let's open it up to the audience here, and we'll take a few questions. I saw that hand, and then this hand as a start, and we'll go around. We'll take a few at a time. And if you could super briefly just identify yourself. Go ahead. Yep.
Very nice. Good morning, or it's already afternoon. No, good morning still. My name is Ieva Ilves. I'm from Latvia, but I'm currently here. And I had two questions, one for a Human Rights Commissioner and then another for Microsoft President. So for human rights, I can't agree more that obviously the universal principles that we have agreed on an analog world, so to say, should be held in digital. But my problem is, and I have been posted working in Azerbaijan on human rights, and I have done a lot of Russia and others, Belarus, and I have feelings that actually we had, before the digital world came in with a big, that we had those problems in analog world, that actually understanding on human rights and implementation of those existed pre-digital world, that, if you look at Council of Europe and 47 members that are supposedly following human rights and democracy and rule of law, we know how different they are, starting from Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkey, and ending up with France, UK, Germany, and so on. So I have feelings that actually the problems that we face with human rights in digital realm is nothing new. It's actually bringing up on surface the conflicts or the different understanding of those things that we exist. And I just wonder whether that is something that you share, and how should we deal with it? Because I see that difference every day if you deal with countries like Azerbaijan. And it has, the digital component is only kind of add-on tool of how those things are exploited.
Great.
And for Microsoft, if I could ask your opinion of copyright directive. I'm running myself for European Parliament, so I'm enjoying quite a bit of campaign, a lot of debate. It has very negative attitude, obviously, coming from here. I myself feel a little bit aligned with you when you say that we need regulation, and this is one of the fields. We need some sort of sort out things, how we pay for work, how we support people who create the content, and then big businesses that make profit of that content. I'm not sure what's the best way to do it, but I have a feeling, like you said, we should create regulation, we should try to implement, and we should try to fix it. But maybe you have some opinion on this particular document.
Great. Two more quickly, right here. Go ahead.
Wait, question?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Anil Gupta, Business Strategy Professor, University of Maryland, and I do research at the intersection of technology and policy. Question to Brad Smith. And, so there's an inherent tension between two things you said. Number one, of course, companies, they exist to sell products to customers. And obviously, it's the larger customers that matter more than smaller customers. On the other hand, you have principles. And so, it's one thing to, let's say, not sell a product to a particular prison or a particular city, but what if it is one of the largest economies in the world, and and there is an opportunity to sell them products, whether for surveillance or for other usage, military usage. How does the corporate strategy side of the company then align with the principles side of the company?
Great. Last question over here, and then you guys decide which piece.
Yes, hi, I'm John S. Knight Fellow here at Stanford. A question for Mr. Smith. Recently, Microsoft got under fire because of cooperation, partnering up with a Chinese university. That has something to do with the Chinese military, and it's being accused to be complicit in the persecution of the Muslim minority in Xinjiang in the West. How do you reply on that response?
Okay. So because I have just one question, I start?
Yeah.
Well, I think, of course, human rights violations has happened since the history of humanity. It didn't start with digital technologies as well. And of course, there are countries who have very weakened institutions where the rule of law is not the rule, and we are working on all those places, working with governments, try to engage them to improve the quality of the rule of law, to the quality of the laws, the strength of their institutions, or we are training the armed forces and the security forces so they do their job, because that's an important role of the state to ensure security, but you can do it according to the standards of human rights laws and humanitarian laws. And we're working in many countries, for example, with the G5 Sahel in Africa, because they are fighting terrorism. And this is something very complicated many times, how you deal with terrorism and human rights. Because there's one thing, I'm talking about real terrorism, because there's lots of countries who don't permit people's different opinions and so on, and they use the term, they qualify somebody as terrorist not being a terrorist, just because he's somebody who is critics, just because he's a journalist who writes the points of view, etc. But I'm talking about countries who really have to face terrorism, like all these countries in Africa dealing with these armed groups that are killing civilians. So we are working with them and to ensure that they will do their job. They will defend the country. They will defend the people, but according to certain standards. And the same thing we're going to do in the future, near future with Mexico. I just came back from Mexico. They have acknowledged, the current government, that they have a huge crisis on security and human rights, 40,000 people with enforced disappearance, 23,000 bodies not identified, 1,300 mass graves found, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're asking for our support to how we can help them through technology, forensic technology, satellite technology, and of course DNA and whatever forensic technology it is, to support them in identifying and giving truth and justice to the people, to the families. But going back, so we understand that this is before, it happens all over the world, in developed countries and developing countries. But what we are talking about is not on the old kinds of human rights violation. We're talking of the challenges of human rights that technology can pose, the kind of threat that we have identified, as well as technology being fantastic on many issues. I would love to have more technology that could help us to identify early warning signs that will help us prevent conflicts from happening, for example, or prevent us by human violations from happening, because you can find early warning signs. And we do that, monitoring and so on, but technology could permit us to do it in an easier way. Probably facial recognition would help us identify perpetrators of genocides and other things that will lead to the investigators of criminal investigations to get into, to held accountable those perpetrators. So technology can pose fantastic opportunities in human rights. I'm talking now specifically in human rights. But then we know all the challenges we have been talking about on the threats for human rights. So it's not that we are only looking, that it has highlighted, but it poses new challenges, a new possibility of human rights. So we have to deal with old ones, but also with these new ones.
Great. Brad?
So let me try quickly to go through the three questions that folks had for me. Let me first start with the question about principles. If you create principles, but then say there's going to be an exception if there's a large amount of money you can make, That's not really a principle. So by definition, you have to have the support at the top of a company. And in our case, I feel that we have it from our board of directors. I feel that we have it from Satya Nadella. I feel that we have a shared understanding among our senior leadership team. And it doesn't mean that you don't have debates. But we have this bedrock commitment, in my view, to sticking to our principles. And the people in corporate strategy or sales may not always be enthusiastic about the application of the principle to a specific outcome. And that's why they're called debates. And that's why, sometimes, people say they're unhappy with the decision. But we know our minds. We know where we stand as a company. I think that this recent question, it arose last week from a story about China, I think is very important at two different levels, and I think it is of direct relevance to people at Stanford and elsewhere. At one level, I feel that it's an imperative that we are sticking to our principles and have the right kinds of controls in place to ensure that we're not licensing or providing our technology for uses that would restrict or violate people's human rights, including the use of facial recognition in ways that could lead to mass surveillance. And we've been looking again, and we haven't found any instances where we believe we are, but it's a good reminder we have to make sure that these things are being implemented effectively everywhere around the world. The interesting thing about the article about China is that fundamentally, what it really talked about was basic research. We have 1,200 PhDs at Microsoft Research, and some of them have dual appointments, including at places like Stanford. And one of the three papers that was highlighted in this story was, in fact, a paper that was written when two of our researchers and a couple of people on leave from a Chinese university were all working together at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia. And they wrote and they published a paper. And that if you really look at what people were working on, it really is sort of basic research advances, typically in fields like machine learning. And one of the things that we apply as a company that is not universally shared across the industry, I think the industry would be better if it were, is a commitment to publish papers in the basic research field. And of course, what I would also point out is that when there is an advance in machine learning, it goes back to Eileen's point, it's open to the world, it will be used by the world, it will be used in good ways and ways that someday will cause concern. But I don't think any of us would say, well, then let's stop all research in machine learning. I think that's the wrong answer. Equally, I think it's the wrong answer to start to put pressure on researchers in the United States, whether they be at Microsoft or Google or Stanford or MIT, that says don't work anymore with people doing basic research in China. I think that is a recipe to begin to hold back technology leadership and growth in the United States itself. And it is a recipe to hold back basic human understanding in fields of science and technology that are foundational for the world. But this is becoming a topic that we will need to discuss in a more nuanced way, and not in a way that I fear could emerge, where it says, gee, you had an American doing basic research with someone in China, therefore somebody thinks that's bad by definition. That will be a step backwards all around. Finally, on the European Copyright Directive, two thoughts. The most important thing about the Copyright Directive for AI is what did not end up in it. Until the very end, there was a risk that it would have a provision that basically would have made subject to copyright control, if you will, we would all call reading. Under copyright law, if you copy something, if you create a derivative work, that's always been something that's been considered an infringement on an exclusive right. But we are always all, as humans, permitted to read. There were some in Europe that wanted to say, but if machines are doing the reading, that now is subject to copyright, and a license fee is going to have to be paid to the owner of that data set. And we and many others in the tech sector felt that this was going to put a brake on AI development around the world, and I applaud the decisions by the European Union to drop that. Now what people are focused on is another aspect, which is the responsibility of a platform, in effect, to address content that's getting uploaded that may be infringing someone else's copyright. And I think this is just one example of many where there is going to be more pressure put on those of us in the tech sector to ensure to a greater degree than we have to date that the law is respected when people are using our platforms. And this will be a lively debate. It always has been, but I think it is going to be more front and center, not just in the years ahead, but even in the coming weeks. Because certainly in the wake of the terrorist tragedy and attack, in Christchurch, governments are, I think, quite properly looking at those of us in the tech sector and saying, we believe you should do more than you have done. And yeah, I've been among those who've said, they're right, we need to do more. But we have to also find a way to do it in an efficient, effective, feasible manner that is consistent with the state of the art in technology that exists today. We have to push ourselves every day, but I always say the rule of law ultimately gets trumped by the laws of physics. If a legislature passes a law that says one must do something that is not physically possible to do, it's usually a recipe for frustration. So we have to find our way through that, and I believe there is a way through. But the copyright directive is just one flavor of a broad set of issues.
Okay, super fast, a couple more questions. I see one there, and back there. Super fast.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Kaylana. I'm an undergraduate here. My question is about an issue Mr. Smith raised earlier about where countries choose to store data and the implications for human rights. And from my understanding, Microsoft has taken a pretty unique position in choosing to comply with data laws around the world, including data localization laws, which would require that Microsoft store data in each of the countries it chooses to operate if it's required. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate more generally on how companies can balance respect for countries' laws and sovereignty, including their need to access for information for law enforcement purposes, with, as you mentioned, the need to protect freedom of expression and privacy in countries where they may use access to information to infringe upon human rights. Thank you.
Right here.
Hi, I'm Lisa Reinsberg with the International Justice Resource Center, and I think it's an agreed premise of the conversation today that the international human rights framework is the relevant foundation for this discussion. But of course, that framework is constantly evolving based on how human rights bodies apply it to new and different situations. So I'm curious for your views on what the investments are that are necessary to make that framework accessible to people everywhere, so that users, including civil society, can access human rights bodies' decisions, reports, recommendations, so that framework remains relevant.
Great. Third. Yep.
Hi, my name's Sofka Brown. I work for the British Government's Science and Innovation Network. I thought you made some great points about regulation being required. The British government has just put out for consultation a piece of sort of draft legislation. One of the things that seems vital is to make sure that we are using data and evidence to support policy making. And so I wondered if you might give a perspective both from industry and then from international governance in terms of the best way of building that evidence base. Once we've got a kind of regulatory sandbox approach, since that seems to be what you're advocating, how do we make sure that we build in the right kind of feedback loop and particularly get companies involved in ensuring that regulation has a positive net benefit?
Great. Unfortunately, those are our last three questions, I think. So.
It's fine.
Go ahead, you want to go first?
Oh, yeah.
Want me to go
Well, I
first?
think-
Whichever,
You go first because I think.
I'll go for, okay,
I
two, I
think
think two of them, yes, although I think when it comes to the accessibility of the human rights decisions, and I think the OHCHR is doing great work and we applaud it, and we always want to provide technology, including our technology, to help UN human rights do even more, and we've had a great technology partnership, and we took the lead in committing $5 million to support that kind of work in a variety of ways. But let me address the couple of other questions. Number one, whenever you go to a country, you have to comply with its laws. So in some ways, one of the most important questions is whether you go. And today we have data centers that we own and operate or lease in just more than 20 countries, which means there's more countries that are absent than present. And that's why these human rights impact assessments are so important, in my view, when we're making the decisions about whether to put data in a country. But we do recognize that once you're there, you're going to have no choice but to comply with the law in that space. When it comes to government policy decisions that are grounded in data, the first thing I would say is it has just been fascinating to me to see the breakthroughs that can come when we really unleash the power of great data scientists to help governments and the public better understand the issues that are being dealt with in public policy. And I just think if you look at public policy debates around the world, and certainly especially in the United States, I just think there's many days when we just all feel that people are talking past each other. And one of the fundamental questions that I think we have to ask ourselves in any business or in any government or more broadly is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And great data can help bring people together to better understand that problem. Just one example that we've been focused on in our corner of the United States around Seattle is affordable housing. And we recently made a $500 million investment commitment to support the construction of more low and middle income housing. But part of what we did was have our data science team work with publicly available data and data that Zillow shared with us. And that was a game changer. We suddenly found that mayors and the media were focused on just this understanding of the problem, and it started to bring people together that previously had not really been talking as much with each other. And so as we look to the future, I think one of the great opportunities is to make sure that more data sets are being made accessible. That includes government data sets, but it also includes private data sets. I think that we have huge opportunities to make advances in, just call it data science or analytics methodology. It's why at Microsoft Research we've started to create and publish what we call data sheets for data sets, to help institutions come together and work with data sets that may not currently be usable in an efficient and an effective way. I think we need a broad open data initiative, basically for governments and for the world, that I believe can do over the next decade for data what open source did for software development itself. Namely, it can really democratize access to data in ways that will enable institutions that hold smaller data sets to better federate their data and get the economies of scale that are essential for data use. And I think if we can combine these advances in how we use data with just some great examples of how the use of data is leading to better public policy outcomes, then we can build on that with more work to basically make the case to governments and the public that data-based decision-making is better decision-making. And maybe we can even use that to unlock some of the gridlock that we have faced in too many places around the world.
I just want to jump in for the High Commissioner. In your last answer, I want you to touch on the relationship and the partnership with Microsoft that you have so that people are aware of it and maybe there are other companies interested in engaging with your office. So.
Well, Brad already mentioned that the money they have given to us and that we're working on, and they are creating a technology like a dashboard that will permit us to know exactly what's going on in any country when we analyze and assess a country situation. So we can have all the reporting, monitoring, information of the press, of government, et cetera, to have a really comprehensive approach that will permit us to make better decisions and to decide how to engage or how to react to certain circumstances. And I think, but also I have to say, and I mentioned before, Brad has been a big champion on promoting not only the discussion on technology and human rights, but also promoting with many other companies that they will sort of be signatories of the UN guidelines and principles for business and human rights. And I think that that's a very important issue because, as we mentioned before, we need companies to understand that to be able to include human rights in the way they make decisions, in the way they implement them, etc., will permit a lot of positive things. It's not only about doing the right thing, but it's a smart thing to do, to get involved in that, because it permits to avoid a reputational risk, to have better conditions. We have been working also with Microsoft on ensuring that diversity, but not more than diversity, inclusion at the workplace, at the marketplace, at the whole supply chain, for example, with LGBTI community. And we have a platform with WEF, a World Economic Forum, and 7 very important companies working on this. And it's not easy. They do their best at headquarters, but of course, when you go in a country where it's illegal, and they also have death penalty because of consensual relationship between people of the same sex, adults I'm talking about same sex, it's very complicated. But I just so we are very happy with our partnership, and we hope we can do much more as well. And we hope other companies. But I want to touch very quickly on the things that you, Brad, just mentioned to the question they were made. Yeah, I believe in data. I think data can also have I would say an outcome that maybe is not usually thought about. That is that you can increase transparency of governments, transparency of anti-corruption measures. So I think it can be very important. But as important as data is people, participation, multi-stakeholders, because good policies are not only the ones who have based on more data, because you can have the same data and have different choices, but it's also about people-centered, that you put people on the center of your decisions, but also you include people in the decisions. Not only that you do the good thing for them, is you include them. And this is linked to what we were discussing before, how you include multi-stakeholders in the different debates on all of these things. And in regulation, of course, it will be also important to have a lot of people sitting on the table to discuss the different impacts of regulating what is needed to be regulated, not to over-regulate, but on the other hand, not to be afraid of regulation. So I think, and also with this multi-stakeholders approach, it will be the best possible way to adapt human rights framework to new challenges, as somebody of you mentioned.
Just her question.
So I think that's that is very important. We need to put together people who usually don't speak to themselves, and they're really in silos. So I do believe that both things are very important.
I will sign up for putting people before data.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, please join me in saying thank you to these 2 amazing people.